I was weak and recovering from surgery when my brother suddenly burst in and screamed, "Sign the papers or else!" When I refused, he ripped the IV out while my mother just watched. But the hospital's CCTV caught everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow this story until the very end, and tell me what city you're watching from in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. My name is Emma Sinclair. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a freelance illustrator just north of Seattle. 3 days before everything fell apart, my biggest concern had been getting through emergency surgery. A ruptured gallbladder wasn't exactly on my schedule. 1 minute I thought I had terrible stomach pain, and the next I was waking up in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, antibiotics running through the line, and a nurse reminding me that recovery was going to take time. By the 3rd day, I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Not great, just less miserable. I could sit up without feeling dizzy. I managed to finish half a cup of soup for lunch. My surgeon had stopped by that morning and said everything looked encouraging if I took it easy. That was the plan. Rest. Watch bad daytime TV. Answer a few emails from clients who were wondering why their illustrations would be late. Then go home in another day or 2. Around mid-afternoon, someone knocked lightly before opening the door. I looked up, expecting another nurse. Instead, it was my older brother, Brandon. He walked in carrying a dark blue folder tucked under one arm. "Hey," he said with a smile that looked almost rehearsed. "How are you feeling?" "I've been better." He gave a quick nod and pulled a chair closer to my bed. For a minute, the conversation actually felt normal. He asked what the doctors had said. I asked how work was going. We talked about traffic, the weather, even a baseball game neither of us had actually watched. It almost made me forget how distant we'd become over the last couple of years. Then he placed the folder on the tray table. "I need a favor." I looked at it. "What kind of favor?" "Nothing complicated." He opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. "It's just paperwork." I didn't touch it. "What paperwork?" "The townhouse." I frowned. "Our dad's townhouse?" He nodded like that explained everything. "We're finally wrapping up the estate. Everyone's already agreed. You're the last signature." That immediately sounded strange. "Everyone?" "Yeah." "When did everyone agree?" He shrugged. "We talked." "No," I said. "You talked." "Nobody asked me." His smile faded just a little. "Emma, it's already been worked out. I've never even seen those papers. You don't need to overthink them." That sentence bothered me more than I expected. I reached for the first page anyway. The legal language blurred together through the medication. I could barely focus long enough to read a paragraph. "I can't sign something I haven't read." "You don't have to read every word." "I do. It's standard." "I still want my attorney to look at it." His fingers tapped against the folder. "You seriously want to hire a lawyer over family paperwork?" "I already have one." His eyebrows lifted. "Since when?" "Since Dad passed away." The room became noticeably quieter. The monitor beside my bed continued its steady rhythm while Brandon stared at me without saying anything. Finally, he leaned forward. "Emma, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm making it responsible." "No, you're making it complicated." I shook my head. "I'm in a hospital bed, Brandon. I'm still recovering. If these papers are legitimate, they can wait another week." "They can't." "Why not?" He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "There are deadlines." "What deadlines?" "I'll explain later." "Then explain now." Instead of answering, he pushed the papers closer. "Just sign them." I looked toward the door. Our mother, Diane, had quietly stepped inside a few moments earlier. I hadn't even heard her. She stood against the wall with her purse over one shoulder, watching both of us. "Mom?" I asked. "Did you know about this?" She gave me a small, uncomfortable smile. Honey, maybe just hear your brother out. I am hearing him out. No, Brandon interrupted. You're arguing. I'm asking questions. They've already been answered. They haven't. I pushed the folder back toward him. I'm not signing anything today. For a second, nobody spoke. Brandon's jaw tightened. The polite expression he'd walked in with disappeared completely. His eyes locked on mine, and I watched something shift across his face that I hadn't seen in years. Then, very quietly, he said, "So that's your final answer?" I held his gaze for a second and nodded. Yes. It wasn't dramatic. I wasn't trying to challenge him. I was exhausted. My incision still hurt every time I shifted in bed, and all I wanted was to finish recovering before dealing with lawyers and paperwork. I'll look at everything when I'm home. Brandon let out a short laugh. No, you won't. What does that mean? It means you'll find another excuse. I don't need an excuse. I need time. You've had plenty of time. I've been in surgery. His jaw tightened. You always make everything difficult. I asked to read the papers. You don't trust your own family? I trust legal documents even less when someone wants me to sign them this badly. The room went quiet. I looked toward my mom, hoping she'd step in. She shifted her weight but didn't move closer. Brandon, she said softly. Maybe just give her a day. A day turns into a week. So what? His voice rose. So everything gets delayed because you decide it does. I didn't decide to end up in emergency surgery. For a second, I thought he was finally going to back off. Instead, he grabbed the folder off my tray table so hard the papers slid onto the bed. You're unbelievable. So are you. I reached for the papers. I'm not signing anything. His hand shot forward. Emma, stop. Sign it. No. The word had barely left my mouth before everything happened at once. He reached across the bed. At first I thought he was trying to grab the papers. Instead, he grabbed the tubing connected to my IV. Brandon! He yanked it. Pain exploded through my arm. I gasped as the line ripped free, sending a burning pain through my shoulder. Blood spotted the tape and blanket. What are you doing? I cried. The heart monitor started beeping faster. Brandon took a step back, breathing hard. You made me do this. I looked at my mother. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just stood by the doorway gripping her purse. Mom. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Everything seemed to freeze. My arm burned, and the monitor kept beeping. Then another voice cut through the room. What happened here? A nurse hurried inside carrying a medication scanner. Her name tag read Tessa. She froze when she saw the blood. Oh my God. She crossed the room in seconds. Don't touch anything, she said firmly to Brandon before pressing the emergency button beside my bed. A loud alarm echoed through the hallway. Within moments, more staff rushed into the room. Brandon lifted both hands. This is a misunderstanding. Tessa ignored him. Emma, stay with me. I'm okay. I managed, my voice shaking. No, don't move your arm. She pressed gauze against the bleeding while another nurse brought supplies. Within seconds, the room filled with medical staff checking my vitals and reconnecting my monitors. A doctor I'd never met leaned over me. Can you tell me your name? Emma. Emma Sinclair. Good. Just keep talking to us. Across the room, Brandon kept insisting it had been an accident, changing his explanation every few sentences. Mom quietly said, "It all happened so fast," without looking at me. 2 hospital security officers arrived almost immediately. One positioned himself between Brandon and my bed. The other asked everyone except the medical staff to step into the hallway. I didn't assault anyone, Brandon protested. Sir, the officer replied calmly, I need you to come with me. This is family business. It became hospital business the moment a patient was injured. That was the first sentence that made me feel like someone was finally protecting me. As security escorted Brandon out, he looked back and muttered, "This isn't over." Mom silently followed him without checking on me. The door closed, and for the first time since he'd walked into my room, everything became quiet again. Tessa adjusted the new IV once the doctor confirmed I was stable. "You did the right thing by not signing anything while you were under medication," she said gently. "You heard all that?" "I heard enough." A hospital security supervisor took my statement while another staff member documented my injury. Before leaving, he paused at the foot of my bed. "Ms. Sinclair, one more thing." "Yes?" "The hallway and patient room are covered by hospital security cameras." He glanced toward the closed door. "If the cameras were recording, which they usually are, we should have a clear record of what happened in here." "I'm seeing 2 incidents in your medical history that I think we should talk about." I frowned. "What kind of incidents?" Rebecca turned the monitor slightly so she could still read it while keeping my information private from anyone walking past the room. "They may be nothing," she said, "but I don't like ignoring patterns." The word patterns caught my attention. She clicked on a hospital record from a couple of years earlier. "According to this, you were admitted after falling down a staircase." I nodded. "That happened at home. You suffered a concussion and a fractured wrist." "Yeah," Rebecca kept reading. "There's also a nursing note that says your cardiac monitor was found disconnected overnight." I looked at her, confused. "I don't remember that." "You probably wouldn't. You were receiving medication and recovering from the head injury." She wasn't trying to alarm me. If anything, she sounded careful. "The note says a nurse reconnected it after discovering it had been turned off." "Turned off?" She nodded. "There wasn't enough information at the time to determine whether it was accidental or intentional." I searched my memory. Bits and pieces came back. The hospital food, the headaches, Brandon stopping by with coffee one afternoon. Nothing else. I honestly don't remember anyone mentioning that. Rebecca made another note. "That doesn't necessarily mean someone did something wrong," she said. "It simply means the incident was documented." I appreciated that she wasn't jumping to conclusions. Neither was I. She opened another record. "This admission was last year." I immediately recognized it. "My knee surgery." "You were recovering well?" she said. "Then there's another note." She paused. "This one says your pain pump settings had been changed while you were asleep." I stared at her. "What?" "The medication was adjusted without a physician's order." "That can't be right." "The nurse on duty corrected it once she noticed." My stomach tightened. "I don't remember that either." Rebecca looked up from the screen. "Again, I'm not saying these events are connected. I'm only asking questions because today's incident requires us to review anything that might help us understand the full picture." I slowly nodded. That made sense. It was the first explanation I'd heard all day that wasn't trying to convince me of something. It was simply asking me to look at facts. She asked another question. "Do you remember who visited you during either of those hospital stays?" I started answering automatically. "My mom came almost every day." Then I stopped. "And Brandon?" Rebecca didn't react. She simply waited. "He visited after the fall," I said quietly. "And he came by after my knee surgery too." "Were you ever uncomfortable with him being there?" "No." The answer came out quickly. Maybe too quickly. I thought about it again. "He could be pushy sometimes." "In what way?" "He always wanted to handle things himself." "Like paperwork?" "Paperwork. Bills. Talking to doctors." I gave a small shrug. "He'd act like he knew what was best." "Did you ever tell him to stop?" "I didn't think I had a reason to." The room fell quiet for a moment. Rebecca closed the chart but didn't stand up. "I know this isn't easy," she said. Sometimes people only recognize a pattern after something happens that they can't explain away. Her words stayed with me. I wasn't ready to believe there had been a pattern. Not yet. But for the first time, I couldn't dismiss the possibility either. A soft knock came from the open doorway. One of the nurses stepped inside carrying a small evidence bag. "Rebecca," she said. "Security recovered the paperwork his brother brought." Rebecca nodded. "Good. Add it to the incident file." The nurse hesitated before leaving. "Oh, and risk management would like copies of Ms. Sinclair's previous admissions too." Rebecca slowly looked back at me. "I think we're going to need to take a much closer look at those older records." I couldn't stop thinking about what Rebecca had said. A pattern. That word stayed with me long after she left the room. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Hospitals were busy places. Equipment malfunctioned. People made mistakes. Not everything was part of some larger story. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. A little while later, Rebecca came back carrying a printed copy of several nursing notes. "I thought it might help if we reviewed these together," she said. "You don't have to." "I know, but I'd rather hear your perspective than make assumptions." She sat beside my bed again and pointed to the first note. "This one documents the disconnected cardiac monitor." I read the short paragraph. It wasn't dramatic. Just a few clinical sentences describing that the monitor had been found unplugged during a routine overnight check and immediately reconnected. No explanation, no conclusion, just facts. "I honestly don't remember this happening," I admitted. "That's common," Rebecca said. "Patients recovering from surgery or receiving pain medication don't always remember small events." She flipped to the second report. "This one involves your knee surgery." The note explained that the settings on my pain pump had been changed without authorization. The nurse had caught it during a routine assessment before it caused any serious problems. Again, there was no accusation, only documentation. Rebecca looked at me. "Do either of these admissions stand out to you now?" I rubbed my forehead, trying to pull memories together. "My mom visited every day." She nodded. "And Brandon?" I hesitated. "He came too." "Both times?" I closed my eyes for a second. Images started coming back. Brandon sitting beside my hospital bed while answering one of his work calls. Brandon insisting on speaking to one of the nurses because he thought I was being discharged too slowly. Brandon telling me not to worry because he was handling everything. I opened my eyes again. "Yeah." Rebecca stayed quiet. "He was there both times." The words felt heavier once I actually said them. "I'm not saying he did anything," I added almost immediately. "I don't know that." "You don't have to decide that today," Rebecca replied. "I just don't want to accuse someone without proof." "I understand." She folded the papers and placed them back in the folder. "Our job isn't to decide guilt. Our job is to recognize risk." That sentence landed differently. Risk, not certainty. Just enough concern to pay attention. For years, I'd explained Brandon's behavior away. He was protective. He liked being in control. He talked over people because he thought he knew better. None of those things automatically made someone dangerous. But today was different. I looked down at the fresh bandage wrapped around my arm. No matter how many excuses I made for him before, I'd watched him rip out my IV with my own eyes. No one could explain that away. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. Rebecca glanced toward it. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." I picked it up anyway. It wasn't Brandon. It was my mom. One message. "Please don't make this bigger than it already is." A second message appeared almost immediately. "Your brother lost his temper. That's all. The police don't need to get involved." Then another. "Families work these things out privately." I stared at the screen. Not one message asked whether I was okay. Not one. Rebecca didn't try to read over my shoulder. She simply noticed the expression on my face. Is everything all right? I turned the phone around so she could see. She read the messages without saying anything. When she handed the phone back, her voice stayed calm. Would you like us to document those messages as well? I hadn't even considered that. They matter? They might. For the first time all day, I stopped thinking about protecting my family's reputation. I started thinking about protecting myself. I silenced my phone and placed it face down on the table. A quiet knock came from the doorway. I expected another nurse. Instead, I heard a familiar voice. Emma? I looked up. Naomi Parker stood in the doorway holding a paper coffee cup and looking more worried than I'd ever seen her. I came as soon as I heard what happened. Naomi crossed the room in 3 quick steps before pulling up short beside my bed. I wanted to hug you, she said with an awkward smile, but I figured that might not be the best idea. I actually laughed. It was only for a second, but it was the first genuine laugh I'd managed all day. I appreciate the thought. She set a paper cup on the bedside table. I brought coffee for myself and hot tea for you. I remembered you always complain hospital tea tastes like warm cardboard. That hasn't changed. She rolled her eyes. Some things never do. For the next few minutes, we barely talked about what had happened. Instead, Naomi pulled out her phone and opened the email thread we'd been sharing before my surgery. One of your clients keeps asking when you'll finish those children's book illustrations. I groaned. Don't remind me. He actually ended his last email with, "Tell Emma to recover first." That makes me feel slightly less guilty. See? The world isn't ending because you missed a deadline. She started telling me about a local art fair I'd planned to attend before ending up in the hospital. One of our favorite vendors had accidentally displayed a painting upside down for half the afternoon before anyone noticed. I laughed again. This time, it lasted a little longer. For a few minutes, the hospital room felt almost normal, not because everything was okay, just because someone was treating me like Emma instead of patient Sinclair. Eventually, Naomi looked at the bandage on my arm. Her smile faded. So, what actually happened? I told her everything. Brandon bringing the folder, the pressure to sign, my mom standing there, the IV, the security officers. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and slowly shook her head. I knew your brother could be controlling, she said quietly. I didn't think he'd do something like that. Neither did I. Silence settled between us for a moment. Then she asked a question I wasn't expecting. What are you going to do when you go home? I'll recover. No. She looked directly at me. I mean, are you going to be safe there? I frowned. My house? You live alone? Yeah. Does Brandon have a key? I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. He might? I gave him a spare key a couple of years ago while I was traveling for work. Did you ever get it back? I honestly don't know. Naomi let out a slow breath. I think the first thing you should do is change the locks. That seems a little extreme. Emma? Her voice stayed calm. He assaulted you in a hospital. When she said it out loud, the sentence sounded even harsher than it had in my head. You don't know what he'll do once you're discharged. I don't think he'd break into my house. Maybe he wouldn't. She shrugged. But if you don't know where that spare key is, why take the chance? I looked away. She wasn't trying to frighten me. She was being practical. And I'd install a couple of security cameras, she continued. They're not even expensive anymore. I've never needed them. You never thought you'd need hospital security either. I couldn't argue with that. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. Then again. And again. Naomi glanced at the screen. You don't have to read those. I know. But I picked it up anyway. Every notification came from my mother. Please don't let strangers get involved. Your brother already feels terrible. Families forgive each other. Call me before you speak to anyone else. Not one message asked how I was feeling. Not one apologized for what I'd been through. Naomi quietly watched my expression change. She keeps saying the same thing, doesn't she? I nodded. She just wants this handled inside the family. Naomi sighed. Emma, I think she's worried about protecting Brandon, not protecting you. The words stung because they sounded true. I locked my phone without replying. Something on the bedside table caught my eye. The blue folder. Someone from security had returned it after documenting it as evidence for the hospital report. It was sitting exactly where Brandon had left it. Naomi followed my gaze. Is that the paperwork? Yeah. Are you finally going to see what he was so desperate for you to sign? I slowly reached for the folder and rested it on my lap. Then I opened the cover. I slid the first page out of the folder. At first glance, it looked like any standard legal document. My name. Brandon's name. The address of my father's townhouse. Paragraph after paragraph of legal language that made my eyes hurt even more than my incision. Naomi scooted her chair closer. Need a second pair of eyes? Please. She leaned in while I kept reading. The first section confirmed exactly what Brandon had claimed. If I signed it, I would permanently give up my ownership interest in Dad's townhouse. In exchange, I'd receive a one-time cash payment. The amount wasn't insulting, but it was nowhere near the property's value. I frowned. This doesn't even make financial sense. Naomi nodded. It definitely favors Brandon. I turned another page, then another. Halfway through the document, a paragraph caught my attention. I read it once, then a second time. What? Naomi asked. I handed her the page. She read silently before looking back at me. Seriously? I pointed to the paragraph. It says I agree not to discuss this agreement or any related family matters with attorneys, the media, law enforcement, or any third party. Naomi stared at me. That's oddly specific. I was thinking the same thing. The clause wasn't just asking for privacy. It was trying to keep me from talking to anyone, not just now, forever. If everything was fair, Naomi said quietly, why would they care who you talk to? Neither of us had an answer. I kept flipping through the papers. There were signature lines, witness sections, a notary acknowledgement. Everything had already been prepared. All Brandon needed was my signature. Then something else caught my eye. The date. I blinked. No. What? I checked it again to make sure I wasn't reading it wrong. This agreement was drafted. My voice faded. Naomi leaned over my shoulder. 5 days before your surgery. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. 5 days. Before anyone knew whether I'd have complications. Before I was admitted. Before I was lying in this hospital bed with pain medication in my system. Brandon hadn't shown up with random paperwork. He'd arrived with a plan. A plan that existed before I ever went into the operating room. A chill ran through me. I remembered how determined he'd been. Not asking, not negotiating, demanding. Sign it now, not tomorrow. Not after speaking with a lawyer. Now. Naomi slowly closed the folder. I don't think today was impulsive. I don't either. The realization settled between us. This wasn't just about losing his temper. He'd expected to find me weak, medicated, and willing to sign. Instead, I'd refused. I leaned back against the pillow and let out a long breath. For the first time since everything started, I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I wasn't. Someone had planned to pressure me into giving away my legal rights while I was recovering from emergency surgery. Whatever happened next, I couldn't ignore that. Naomi watched me carefully. What are you thinking? I looked at the folder. Rebecca asked earlier if I wanted to report this. And? I picked up my phone. I think it's time I talk to the police. Before I could unlock the screen, another hospital staff member knocked lightly on the open door. Emma? Yes? I have something that was just delivered for you. She handed me a large white envelope. The return address belonged to a law firm. I didn't recognize the attorneys, but I immediately recognized the client listed underneath, representing Brandon Sinclair. I felt my stomach tighten as I carefully opened the envelope. I pulled the letter out of the envelope with a shaky hand. The first page carried a law firm's letterhead. The second page carried Brandon's accusations. I read the opening paragraph once, then again. It claimed I'd manipulated our father during the final months of his life. According to the letter, I'd pressured him into changing financial decisions for my own benefit. I lowered the paper. What? Naomi reached for it. Can I? I nodded. She read in silence, her eyebrows climbing higher with every paragraph. This is unbelievable. I've never even discussed Dad's finances without him present. The letter continued for several pages. It demanded that I preserve documents related to the estate. It warned me against interfering with ongoing legal proceedings, and it strongly suggested that if I continued making accusations against Brandon, his attorneys would respond aggressively. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Just a few hours earlier, my brother had ripped an IV out of my arm. Now, I was apparently the one being portrayed as dishonest. Naomi folded the papers carefully. Do they actually have evidence? I don't know. Or are they hoping this scares you into backing down? That possibility hadn't crossed my mind. Before I could answer, there was another knock at the door. Rebecca stepped inside. I heard an officer is available if you'd still like to make a report. I looked at the letter, then at the bandage wrapped around my arm, then at Naomi. For a moment, I honestly considered saying no. Not because I believed Brandon deserved another chance, because I suddenly understood how messy this was about to become. If this turned into a legal fight, my family's problems wouldn't stay private anymore. Everyone would know. Friends, extended relatives, people who'd known my father. Rebecca seemed to notice the hesitation. You don't have to decide based on anyone else's expectations. Naomi quietly added, You also don't have to let this letter decide for you. She was right. The accusations on those pages hadn't changed what happened in my hospital room. I took a slow breath. I'll speak with the officer. About 20 minutes later, a detective from the local police department introduced himself and pulled a chair beside my bed. His voice stayed calm from beginning to end. I'm just going to ask you to describe everything in your own words. So I did. I explained the emergency surgery, the folder. Brandon insisting I sign immediately. The argument, the IV, the security staff. The detective never interrupted. He simply took notes and occasionally asked for clarification. Did anyone witness the incident? Yes. The nurses. My mother. And hospital security arrived almost immediately. I also handed him copies of the text messages my mother had sent asking me not to involve the police. Rebecca provided photographs of my injury and confirmed that the hospital had already documented everything. The security footage has been preserved, she added. The detective nodded. That's helpful. Before leaving, he gave me a case number. If you remember anything else, contact me directly. I slipped the card into the folder beside the legal papers. By the time he walked out, I felt emotionally drained, but strangely, I also felt lighter. For the first time since Brandon entered my room, I wasn't carrying the entire story by myself anymore. Someone else had heard it. Someone else was documenting it. Naomi smiled. I'm proud of you. I don't feel brave. You don't have to. She squeezed my shoulder gently. You just have to keep telling the truth. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I called the attorney who had handled some of my father's paperwork a few years earlier. He couldn't discuss the details of the estate over the phone, but he did confirm one thing. There is already an active inheritance dispute. My stomach tightened. When was it filed? He checked the date. Almost 2 weeks before your hospitalization. I thanked him and ended the call. 2 weeks. Brandon had started a legal fight before I ever entered the operating room. The hospital confrontation hadn't started this conflict. It was part of a plan already in motion. As I lay awake that night, one thought kept returning. If Brandon was claiming I'd manipulated Dad, then somewhere there had to be records showing what Dad actually wanted. A few days later, after I was discharged and finally back home, I unlocked the small filing cabinet in my father's old study. Most of the folders contained ordinary paperwork. Tax records, insurance forms, utility bills. Then, tucked behind a stack of notebooks, I found a worn leather journal I had never seen before. The leather journal felt older than I expected. The edges were worn, and Dad's handwriting covered almost every page. At first, I smiled. He'd always written things down. Shopping lists, ideas, appointments, even little reminders that made no sense to anyone but him. For a few minutes, reading the journal almost felt like hearing his voice again. Most of the early entries were exactly what I expected. Updates about doctor's appointments, medication schedules, physical therapy, small notes reminding himself to walk a little farther each week. I caught myself smiling when I found one line that read, "Emma still worries too much." "You're not wrong," I whispered. Then the tone of the journal slowly changed. The entries became less personal and more organized. Dates, dollar amounts, copies of check numbers, transfers between accounts. Dad had written short explanations beside almost every expense. Most were ordinary: property taxes, roof repairs, medical bills. Then I noticed one name appearing over and over: Brandon. I leaned forward. Several entries mentioned money Dad had loaned Brandon. Some were a few $100s, others were several thousand. Next to one payment Dad had written, "Promised this would be the last request." A few pages later, another note appeared. "Another emergency, according to Brandon. I hope he's telling me the truth." I frowned. Growing up, I knew Brandon occasionally borrowed money. I had no idea it happened this often. The farther I read, the more concerned I became. One entry stopped me completely. "Found unauthorized withdrawal today. Brandon says it was a misunderstanding. Need to review bank records." I read that sentence 3 times. Dad never sounded emotional in his journal. He simply recorded facts, which somehow made the words even more unsettling. I took out my phone and started photographing the pages. Not because I wanted to use them immediately, because I suddenly understood they might matter. As I carefully turned another page, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the desk. It wasn't part of the journal. It was a printed email. Actually, several emails. Dad had exchanged messages with my Uncle Gregory. The first few were ordinary. Updates about family gatherings, Dad's health, holiday plans. Then one subject line caught my attention: Brandon. I unfolded the pages completely. Dad had written, "I'm becoming increasingly concerned that everyone keeps dismissing Brandon's behavior as sibling conflict. It isn't that simple anymore." I stopped reading for a second. My chest tightened. I'd spent years wondering if I had exaggerated the tension between my brother and me. Apparently, Dad had reached the same conclusion long before I did. I continued reading. Gregory replied that he had noticed Brandon becoming more aggressive whenever money or property came up. Dad answered only a few hours later, "If anything happens to me, I don't want Emma pressured into giving up what I've already decided. She'll probably try to keep the peace, and that's exactly what worries me." I covered my mouth. Dad knew me. He knew I hated conflict. He knew I'd rather compromise than argue. And somehow, he'd anticipated someone might try to use that against me. I wasn't just reading old family correspondence anymore. I was reading a father trying to protect his daughter. Tears blurred the page for a moment. Not because of the inheritance, because I realized he'd been carrying these concerns by himself. I carefully placed every page back into order before sliding them into a document folder. Those emails deserved to be preserved. So did the journal. My phone rang just as I finished organizing everything. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Hello? Ms. Sinclair? Yes. This is Detective Marcus Bennett. His voice was calm and professional. I wanted to let you know the investigation is moving forward. I glanced at the journal on the desk. I've actually found some documents that may be relevant. I'd like to review those. I can do that. There is one more thing, he said. We're scheduling separate interviews with everyone involved. Everyone? You. Your mother. Your brother. And any other family members who may have relevant information. He paused briefly. I've found that people often remember very different versions of the same day. I looked back at my father's journal. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether the truth existed. I was wondering which version of it everyone else was about to tell. Detective Bennett kept me updated more often than I expected. He never shared confidential details, but every few days he'd call with a brief progress report. I wanted you to know we're continuing to collect statements, he told me during one conversation. Has everyone agreed to cooperate? Most people have. The pause before that last sentence caught my attention. What does most mean? It means some interviews have been more consistent than others. I understood exactly who he meant. A week later, I met with Detective Bennett at the police station to hand over copies of Dad's journal and the emails between him and Uncle Gregory. He carefully flipped through every page. You've kept the originals? Locked away. Good. He placed the copies into an evidence folder. These don't prove everything by themselves, he said, but they help establish context. I'll take context over rumors. He gave me a small smile. So will I. Before I left, I couldn't stop myself from asking, have you spoken to my mom? We have. And? I'm limited in what I can discuss. I know. He rested one hand on the folder. I can tell you this much. Her account changed during the interview. I stayed quiet. Initially, she said she didn't see exactly what happened. He glanced at his notes. Later, she acknowledged she was standing in the doorway. I felt my stomach sink. And after reviewing other evidence, she described the argument in more detail than she originally claimed. I closed my eyes for a second. That sounded exactly like my mother. Never telling one complete lie. Just leaving pieces out until she couldn't anymore. She isn't being charged with anything, Detective Bennett added, but inconsistent statements tend to raise additional questions. When I walked back to my car, I didn't feel angry, just tired. I kept wondering how much easier everything could have been if she'd simply told the truth the first time. A few days later, Detective Bennett called again. I wanted to make you aware of something before you hear it elsewhere. What is it? We located someone who previously had a close relationship with Brandon. My brother's ex? Yes. She agreed to speak with us voluntarily. I gripped the phone a little tighter. Did she say anything useful? I can't discuss specifics. Another careful pause. But she described behavior that she believed was controlling. He chose every word carefully. She also recalled an incident involving medical treatment that concerned her. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The silence on the line said enough. For years, I'd convinced myself Brandon only acted that way around me. Now that belief was beginning to fall apart. Later that week, Naomi stopped by my apartment with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. You look exhausted. I feel exhausted. She handed me a container. So don't cook. We ate at my small dining table talking about anything except lawyers for almost an hour. Her stories about difficult freelance clients were ridiculous enough to make me laugh. I'd missed laughing. As she packed up the empty containers, she looked at me. You know. What? You're standing a little straighter. I hadn't noticed. I guess I am. A month ago, you apologized every time someone asked if you were okay. And now? Now you answer the question. It sounded like a small difference. It wasn't. I wasn't trying to convince everyone Brandon was a good person anymore. I was simply describing what had happened. That alone felt like progress. The following afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, the name on the screen surprised me. Uncle Gregory. I answered immediately. Hi, Uncle Greg. His voice sounded calmer than usual. I've spent the last few days reading everything you sent me. The journal? And the emails. I waited. I owe you an apology. For what? I assumed this was another family argument. His voice grew heavier. It wasn't. Hearing those words from him meant more than I expected. He'd always tried to stay neutral. If even he had changed his mind, something important had shifted. I think we need to meet, he said, before the inheritance hearing. What changed? I'd rather show you than explain it over the phone. He paused just long enough to make my curiosity grow. There's something your father wanted me to keep until the right time. The call from Uncle Gregory came while I was organizing copies of the evidence my attorney had asked me to keep in separate folders. His voice sounded different, calmer, more certain. Emma, he said, I'd like to meet you in person before the first hearing. That wasn't what surprised me. It was what he said next. I've finished reading your father's journal. We met 2 days later at a quiet coffee shop not far from his office. My arm was still sore whenever I lifted anything heavy, and I was moving slower than usual, but I didn't want to postpone the meeting. Gregory was already waiting when I arrived. There was a thick envelope sitting on the table beside his coffee. He didn't waste time. I owe you an apology. I looked at him, unsure what he meant. I thought this was just another family inheritance dispute, he admitted. I assumed both sides were exaggerating. He slowly slid the envelope toward me. I was wrong. Inside were printed copies of emails between him and my father, along with notes he'd written after several conversations they'd had during Dad's final year. I kept these because your father asked me to. I carefully turned the pages. Some of the emails were almost identical to the ones I'd already found. Others were new. Dad had written about Brandon becoming increasingly aggressive whenever money or property came up. He described arguments I had never even known had happened. One sentence made me stop reading for a moment. If anything happens to me, please don't let Brandon pressure Emma into giving up what I've legally left her. I swallowed hard. Gregory quietly watched me. He loved both of you, he said, but he was worried. More worried than he ever admitted out loud. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Gregory leaned forward. I've already spoken with your attorney. You have? He nodded. I told her I'm willing to testify. I blinked. You'd do that? I won't lie for anyone, he answered. But I also won't stay silent anymore. That was the first time since all of this started that someone in my own family chose facts over loyalty. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar. We spent another hour reviewing timelines, emails, and financial records. Gregory pointed out details I had overlooked, including several withdrawals Brandon had tried to explain away years earlier. They seemed minor back then, Gregory said, looking at everything together. They don't anymore. Before we left, he put a hand on my shoulder. You're not carrying this alone now. Those words stayed with me all the way home. A few days later, my attorney called. The prosecutor wants to update you. I put the call on speaker while taking notes. The criminal case is moving forward, she said. The hospital records, witness statements, photographs, and security footage give them a solid foundation. So they're filing charges? Yes. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For weeks, it had felt like I was constantly defending myself. Now it finally seemed like people were looking at the evidence instead of family excuses. That evening, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives. Some wished me luck. Others simply asked if the family could still work this out privately. The tone had changed. Not everyone believed Brandon anymore. People were starting to ask questions instead of automatically taking his side. Even my mother stopped sending messages insisting I apologize. She didn't apologize either. She simply went quiet. For the first time in months, silence felt different. Not like avoidance, more like uncertainty. A few days before the scheduled hearing, my attorney called again. Her voice was steady. "There's been a development." "What happened?" "Brandon's legal team contacted the prosecutor this morning." I straightened in my chair. "They're asking to begin plea negotiations." For the first time since he ripped the IV out of my arm, Brandon wasn't insisting he'd done nothing wrong. He was trying to negotiate instead. Brandon accepted a plea agreement a few weeks later. When my attorney called with the news, I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of paperwork that had somehow become part of my daily life. "He won't be taking this to trial," she said. I stayed quiet. "He'll receive probation, mandatory anger management, a psychological evaluation, community service, reimbursement for your additional medical expenses, and a no-contact order." I looked out the window for a long moment. "That's it?" She paused. "I know it probably doesn't feel like enough." She was right. Nothing could undo what happened in that hospital room. Nothing could erase the moment my own brother looked at me and said, "You made me do this." But I also realized something. I wasn't waiting for the court to give me peace. I just wanted the truth to matter. And finally, it did. The inheritance case didn't last much longer. Once Brandon's criminal case was resolved, the civil case started falling apart. My attorney presented Dad's journal, Gregory's testimony, the financial records, and the emails that showed Dad's concerns had existed long before his death. The accusations that I'd manipulated my father never held up. There simply wasn't any evidence. Eventually, Brandon withdrew his claim. The townhouse officially remained mine. Walking back inside after the final hearing felt strange. For months, that house had represented stress, arguments, lawyers, and memories I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. So I made a decision that surprised a few relatives. I sold it. Some people told me Dad would have wanted me to keep it. Maybe. Or maybe he would have wanted me to stop carrying something that had become a constant reminder of conflict. The money helped me pay the legal bills, cover medical expenses, and put a down payment on a smaller apartment in a secure building. It wasn't fancy. It was simply mine. Recovery didn't magically become easy. I started seeing a trauma therapist every week. During one session, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "When was the last time you felt completely safe?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Not because I couldn't think of an answer, because I honestly didn't have one. That realization stayed with me for a long time. My relationship with Mom never really returned to what it had been. A few months later, she mailed me a handwritten letter. She admitted she'd spent years protecting Brandon because she believed he needed more help. She also admitted that protecting him often meant expecting me to stay quiet. She apologized. I believed she meant it. But forgiveness and trust turned out to be two different things. I wrote back. I told her I hoped she was doing well. I also explained that, for now, I needed distance. She respected that. Sometimes that's the healthiest outcome people can manage. As work slowly picked up again, I found myself accepting projects that actually meant something to me. One local nonprofit asked if I'd create illustrations for brochures about recognizing family abuse and finding support. I said yes without thinking twice. For the first time in a long while, drawing didn't feel like escaping reality. It felt useful. Around that same time, I adopted a golden retriever mix from a rescue center. His name was Maple. The shelter volunteer laughed when she handed me the leash. He's convinced every stranger is about to become his best friend. She wasn't wrong. Maple eventually completed therapy dog training, and we started visiting rehabilitation centers together. Watching him gently rest his head on someone's lap reminded me how much comfort could come from the smallest moments. Not every scar disappears. Some simply stop controlling every decision you make. These days, I still lock my doors. I still save every important document. I still pay attention when something doesn't feel right. Those habits aren't driven by fear anymore. They're boundaries. One evening, I came home carrying groceries, Maple trotting beside me. I unlocked the apartment door, stepped inside, and closed it behind us. The automatic lock clicked into place. Maple stretched out on the living room rug like he owned the place. I stood there for a second without moving. It hit me that this was the first home I'd ever lived in where I wasn't waiting for someone to walk through the door and turn everything upside down. The silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. And that was enough. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you for listening to my story. I'd really like to hear what you think. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone in your own family, even when other people didn't understand your decision? Let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely love to read your experiences.